This is the 401k Fridays podcast, and I'm your host, Rick Unser. Now here we go with this week's episode. What a treat today. I'm pleased to welcome Preston Rutledge, founder and principal of the Rutledge Policy Group and previously Assistant Secretary of Labor for the EBSA, and prior to that, Senior Tax and Benefits Counsel for Chairman Orrin Hatch of the U.S. Senate Finance Committee, to the podcast. During our conversation, we hit on a few good stories from his civil service days, talk about the concepts behind the Secure Act and where we go from here, potential tax changes and the impact on retirement plans, and much more. Definitely a good one to check out and share. On that note, if you've been enjoying the podcast, please do take a minute to mention to a friend, colleague, or networking group. As our audience continues to grow, it makes it easier for me to convince people like Preston to join me. That's it. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, Preston, welcome to the podcast. Excited to have you here and excited we got connected by listeners. So thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the chance to meet with you and chat with you today.
Well, we got a ton to talk about, but I thought it might be kind of fun just to maybe share your perspective on DOL enforcement. I think out in the the plan sponsor community, I think the impression is certainly given or portrayed that the DOL is out there to get plan sponsors around every corner. And I don't know, is that fair? Is that accurate? Is that how the Department of Labor would want to be portrayed or seen in the plan sponsor community or even in the provider community for that matter?
Well, that's a good question, and you definitely do hear that. I don't think it's fair to say that EBSA is out to get plan sponsors, and they certainly should not be. Now, they are passionate about ensuring that every plan participant receives their plan benefits, now be that a retirement benefit, health benefit, or other employment-based benefit. But that's their responsibility under the law and their mission. But that said, I'm the first to admit that EBSA has, for example, at times kept audits open for too long. Audits should not, drag on for years and years and years. My advice to plan sponsors that will help, I think, is to keep good records. It's really basic stuff. Keep good records. Keep good contemporaneous documentation of decisions that they've made affecting the plan. And then the work of the auditor early on will be easier to move forward, and it'll help identify issues. So try to get the issues identified, and then work with EBSA to set some schedules, particularly some timing schedules, if possible. But it's a two-way street. EBSA needs to do its part as well to keep in mind that they do need to move through the audit and as promptly as possible and bring things to a close.
No, fair point. Say, there's always two sides to a story. Well, I guess maybe three sides, depending upon who you talk to. But you've also been around in government, and you've been around this whole workplace retirement plan community and everything for a while. Tell me a little bit about your background. Tell me and maybe if there's any good anecdotes or stories that our listeners might find useful or amusing or just something fun to hear about as we're going through our conversation.
Yeah, well, in terms of my background, I have been doing employee benefits a long time, but about 3 years into my life as a private practice attorney, I began doing employee benefits, and I've seen it come and go, and I've been around the block quite a bit in private practice, in government at the IRS, on the Senate Finance Committee more recently, and then this very great honor I had to be the Assistant Secretary of Labor at the head of the Employee Benefit Security Administration. So I'm passionate about retirement policy, but for many people, it's not the most exciting subject. eyes can kind of glaze over during briefings, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of employers would share your thoughts as well. We unfortunately, I won't name names, but you definitely see the occasional look of boredom or confusion in committee meetings. That's for sure.
So sort of in that vein, one of my favorite moments was working with Senator Orrin Hatch early on in my time on the Senate Finance Committee. So we had just finished my first committee hearing on retirement. And of course, I staffed Senator Hatch on that. He was the ranking member at the time. And we were walking back to his office after the hearing. He turns to me and he says something to the effect of, "I was expecting that to be a boring hearing, but it turned out to be a very interesting hearing." And it was a great start for me on the committee with Chairman Hatch. It became chairman a couple of years ago, and he really laid the groundwork for some of our most important retirement legislation, including the bill that ultimately became the Secure Act, which he shepherded through a finance committee hearing in 2016 and reported it out of committee with approval on a 26-0 vote. That's about as bipartisan as you can get, and that was a great moment. So I've really enjoyed working with policymakers like Senator Hatch, who really do care about the subject and want to make progress.
And on that note, when it comes to change in the retirement system or progress, what's important as you kind of look back on maybe your past, or even as you kind of look out into the world we're in today, where there's definitely some things kind of kicking around that are being discussed that could change in the retirement world. So, what does it take to kind of get that moving, or what's a common formula that you've found that is helpful to kind of bring some things along or bring some change along into the retirement system that will help, whether it be employers, employees, et cetera?
Well, of course, creating really good tax incentives to set up plans historically was critical, because most employers, certainly once you get above a certain size, most employers have plans. That is key. We know very well that people will save for retirement, much more likely to save for retirement if they have access to a plan at work. One of the policy changes in recent years that I think has been very successful has been auto enrollment. I think that has dramatically improved plan participation when there is a plan at work. The big challenge in recent years has been helping employers that don't already have a plan to set one up at work. We kind of call that the coverage issue. If there's not a plan at work, there's no plan to join. Auto enrollment cannot operate. So the concept, and this was in the Secure Act, the concept of pooling resources of multiple employers into a single large-scale plan, I think has great promise. I'm thinking about the pooled employer plans from the Secure Act, but also the association retirement plan regulation that was completed in late 2019. These are just now getting off the ground. I think they have great promise. Another innovation that I think we may see, perhaps in this year, or this Congress, I should say, would be allowing employers to make matching contributions based on an employee's payment of their student loan. Using student loan payments as the basis for a 401k match I think could be very helpful, particularly for the younger workers in the company that are still paying off their student loans.
Well, and let me dig in on those two, because I think those are both good points. From a pooled employer plan perspective, it's a lot of alliteration there. I guess, what's your thought? I feel like I'm kind of hearing two narratives in the market right now, where, oh my gosh, this is the bright new shiny object, the new thing for service providers to talk about, and these are going to revolutionize the way that employers think about offering their retirement plans, to the complete other side of the spectrum, where there's really nothing unique about a pooled employer plan, and this is much ado about nothing. So I guess, as you were involved in the Secure Act and kind of bringing that forward, maybe what were your thoughts about where pooled employer plans would gain traction, and what do you see, kind of, what do your tea leaves say about where these could be going in the future?
So for me, the thing that appealed to me about pooled employer plans, again, thinking about that cohort of employer that doesn't have a plan at all. So just focus on them for a second. Why don't they have a plan? Probably they're smaller. Probably they're busy. They've got their hands full operating a business and keeping employees employed and meeting payroll. They aren't in the business of wanting to run a 401k plan. So a pooled employer plan that allows an employer to plug into a larger pre-existing plan, I think the concept is it would be appealing. Someone else is doing all the administration. Someone else is filling out the paperwork that goes to the IRS. You also end up with, probably because of economies of scale, fees should be lower. Perhaps and hopefully, investment returns will be higher. There's a lot of evidence that the more assets under management, the better the returns. All of those things were designed to draw in the smaller employer that's never wanted to put up with the hassle of setting up the plan. Of course, realizing that also included some fairly generous tax credit for the employer that's never had a plan, that's setting them one up for the first time. So with those together, that was the thinking, and I think it's a little early to judge whether it's just going to be a bright shiny object or whether it's going to be, a revolutionary tool or just maybe something in the middle. Right now, this is the first year, the 2021. This is the first year that they were legal. So legal in the sense of multiple employers that have no connection to each other joining a plan. It's true that multiple employer plans have been around a while, but the employers all had to have some sort of a connection to one another, whether it be they were signatories to the same collective bargaining agreement, or they were in the same industry, some kind of connectivity. The idea of the pooled employer plan is a financial institution could set one of these up and market it to all of their business customers, regardless of what other connection those companies might have. So far, it's 2021. The DOL has received 57 initial filings as of today to start a pooled employer plan. But also there's a lot of regulations left for the DOL and the IRS to produce, and a lot of that will happen this year. So there's folks that are probably also waiting to see what those regulations say and whether the pooled employer plan will be something that's feasible, that's not overly regulated to the point where people lose interest. So I think 2022 and 2023 will be the real years. I do think these policies need a little room to breathe to see if they can accomplish their objectives.
I appreciate you sharing some of that background there, and I think from my perspective, I think pooled employer plans offer kind of an interesting solution, especially as I feel like there's a lot of employers out there who are kind of looking for, if they have a plan already, they're kind of looking for more fiduciary support. They're looking for people that can take responsibility and make some decisions on their behalf. So I think the pooled employer plan for people that have plans already will be an interesting conversation. It's probably not right for everybody, obviously, but I think it'll be an interesting conversation. I think in my mind, where there's probably more debate as to how successful the pooled employer plan is going to be is, will it really help erode the coverage gap or lessen the number of employers out in the marketplace that don't have a plan? That in my opinion, that's I think where we're TBD on how successful pooled employers plans will be on that I guess goal of them.
Fair point. And it might turn out that the plans will have to be there in order to attract the employers that have never had a plan. That might mean initially that employers that already have plans decide they want to reduce their own administrative burdens or offload some of their fiduciary duties. You can't offload all of your fiduciary duties. You have to do a prudent job of selecting a plan and then monitoring how it's performing. But like I say, I think it's going to take a little time to tell. I don't know how much time, but I do think it needs a little time, a little space to see how it turns out.
Yeah, I will definitely give it some time and space before making any further judgments. So I agree with you there. On student loans, this has been kind of kicked around a little bit, and I feel like there's a lot of stuff going on around a lot of conversations around student loans right now. But the idea of providing and I'm using air quotes here, a match on a student loan payment that kind of came about a couple years ago through a private letter ruling, and I think there's a lot of employers that are kind of interested in that. So, what's your take on where we go from here in terms of new protections or new rules that could make that become reality, and what's your take on why that's important or why that's something that you'd like to see happen? And I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, so please clarify if I am.
So I think the thing that will give people comfort would be, like a lot of things, would be legislation that blesses the whole concept. It's been actually of great interest of the current chair of the Finance Committee, Senator Wyden of Oregon. I do think we'll see it in some legislation later this year. And the reason it's important is it's generally, people go through their life cycle and you have, at different times in your life, you have different financial demands. And it's not always easy and perhaps not always appropriate to try to save for retirement if you've got something else you have to do. You have to pay the rent. You have to, maybe save up for a mortgage, pay for college. These are all the competing demands. But at the beginning of your career, in the current world we live in, student loan debt is a big burden on the younger workers. And if we can convert that burden into maybe an incentive also to join the 401k and get started on some money set aside in your earlier years of employment, the benefits of getting even a modest amount of money set aside early and on a regular basis pays off really big because of compound interest. As we all know, it's kind of straightforward math. The trick is getting people to commit if they can, if it's appropriate for their budget, and as early as possible in their working life. So I think legislation is what would make people the most comfortable, and I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for it. So I think we could see it this year. And
maybe just one technical question, because I think I feel like there's some like nomenclature stuff here. I think in ease of explaining it, a lot of people have talked about this conceptually as providing matching on a student loan contribution that someone's making, or so, hey, if you're paying off your student loans, we'll give you a match in the 401k. If you see legislation, do you think they would have this set up so that it would sort of fall under like a true matching category? Or I feel like the way that people are doing it right now is they're doing it more via like a profit sharing contribution or a non-elective contribution, using some type of discretionary concept on that end, because without a deferral, you can't really apply a match. So sorry for the technical question, but do you have any sense on where that might land?
There's a couple of ways they could go. The concept of providing a match the way you do for a deferral would be to just treat a student loan payment as if it was a deferral to a 401k plan. It's more of a measuring stick. A certain amount of money goes to a student loan payment, and a match based upon that payment goes into the 401k. So, but until the details will be vetted and worked out in the legislation when it comes along. There are different ways to do it. That's conceptually probably the simplest way to think about it, but it's a good point. We don't really know right now what the final structure will look like.
Yeah. Well, I think to your point, any progress, any guidance, any further moving this down the path to say, yes, this is something that we approve of, either in concept or, we're going to give you some very specific regulations. I think that'll certainly give more employers maybe the comfort to do something like that, because, hey, as we sit here in early 2021, the competition for talent out there is crazy. I mean, that when I talk to employers, that's kind of one of the number one things that people are concerned about in terms of being able to continue to grow their business is, where do I find people? And there's a lot of people looking for folks out of college, maybe a few years out of college, and student loans, as we've talked about on prior podcast episodes, are a big reality for a lot of people. As I maybe delve into a little more of kind of things that you're seeing on the on the radar screen that could be changing or could be could be kind of a hot topic. I feel like the tax treatment of 401k plans is something that's starting to get some more conversation. We heard at the time candidate Biden talk about how, well, maybe we should move from this kind of current deduction system to a credit system for deferrals that are being made into a 401k or a workplace retirement plan. What's your sense on where that is? Is that just, kind of talk, or is that something that is gaining momentum and could become reality?
I do not think it's just talk. You're correct. The Biden campaign, this is before it was the Biden administration, the Biden campaign revealed a policy proposal to convert the IRA deduction and the 401k deferral to a fixed tax credit. That's a proposal we saw in Congress about 10 years ago. It didn't go anywhere at the time. At the time, the top rate, individual income tax rate, was higher than it is now, and the proposed tax credit was going to be, I think, 18%. There was quite a gap between the value of the tax credit and the value of a deduction or a deferral for someone once they were in a bracket that was higher than 18%. We don't know what the proposal will be this time. First, of course, I guess to your point, we're not 100% certain we're going to see the proposal. If we do, my sense it would probably be later in the year, as we're sort of moving through some of these reconciliation bills that are going to probably come back in the next few months and through the summer. I also have heard that the tax credit number, they've studied it. They'll probably, if they propose it, the tax credit will probably be higher than it was 10 years ago. I read about a 26% tax credit, for example. Again, this is all speculative. But if they chose something in that range, you'd probably find that a lot of people would do as well or even better with their tax credit than they would with a deferral or a deduction. The problem would be, of course, like a lot of things in employee benefits, if the folks operating the company really need those deferrals in order to generate cash flow to pay their matches and things like that, they will be discouraged from setting up plans, or maybe even discouraged from continuing to maintain their plans. A lot of things that are difficult about this are that actually operating businesses is a lot more complex than just whether you get an incentive or something. These incentives for the small business owner actually have a lot to do with cash flow for them. And we did learn that 10 years ago in Congress when we had a hearing on the topic and saw and got some testimony on both sides of the issue. I do think, though, that this is something we might see. I think it fits in with this administration's focus on not just retirement policy and tax policy, but economic equity, equality. Another thing I think we'll see is probably the refundable savers credit, not to use too technical of a term, but it's a concept of using a tax credit that is available even if you do not have a tax liability, to put some money aside for people in an IRA or a 401k account, and the money would be deposited directly into those accounts. We're going to see things like that, I think. Maybe not this spring, maybe, but I think sometime toward the end of the year, if not a little bit earlier.
Got it. Yeah, that's certainly the change in the tax deduction, or the move to a tax credit, I think has certainly gotten the attention of some plan sponsors out there. And, I know in conversations I've had, it's, definitely keep us posted if you hear anything more about that. So I to your point, we'll just kind of see when and if it lands. In terms of other stuff, obviously you were heavily involved in Secure, and we're hearing some rumblings that, there's a Secure 2.0 in the making. So I guess, what does that mean? What do you see as an improvement upon the Secure Act that we've talked a little bit about already, but certainly is much broader than just PEPs, which we've hit on a little bit.
Well, we do expect to see a Secure 2.0. I think we'll probably see something along those lines fairly soon. The chairman of the Ways and Means Committee made a statement, I think maybe it was last week, where he said that the Secure 2.0 would probably be produced in the next few weeks, quote unquote. I think one of the keys on the Secure 2.0 when it comes will probably be to expand auto-enrollment. I mentioned auto-enrollment earlier as being one policy that we've seen work. It's voluntary. I think there's a desire perhaps to have a mandatory auto-enrollment for plans going forward. Now, that word mandatory, the minute you use the word mandate, things can sometimes become a bit of a heavy lift. But policy-wise, making auto-enrollment sort of the standard across the board, I think would be one of the features of a Secure 2.0.
Yeah, and I think I would completely agree with you that automatic enrollment has probably been one of the most effective tools that we've been given over the last decade or so. But I'm with you. I think that getting that to the point where it's required or mandatory is, I think the spirit of that is headed in the right direction. But I think in reality, I don't know that makes sense that every single plan has automatic enrollment. I think there's a lot of different types of businesses out there. There's a lot of complexity in businesses where I think strongly encouraging would be great, but I don't know. I think that you're going to find. I think maybe that moves us in the wrong direction if it's all of a sudden a mandate.
Well, but legislatively, that's why you make proposals. You have markups. You have hearings. You do listen to people. Legislation does get changed and formulated as it goes through the process. There might be grandfathering clauses. There will probably almost certainly be exceptions for smaller businesses. Now, how you define a smaller business will be interesting, and that could be something that gets modified or massaged somehow. But also, sometimes proposals like this might be limited to companies that have been in existence for a certain number of years. You're not hitting a brand new startup with something that is very difficult for them to handle. I think another thing you'll see in 2.0 will be some more tax credits to help finance the setting up of plans by small employers. I just mentioned the Savers credit proposal. I think that probably might be part of a Secure 2.0. So we'll see, but one thing I do believe will happen, and this would be interesting to watch and track, once it's introduced, I do believe that it will be fairly promptly moved, because it's the chairman's bill, the chairman of Ways and Means, fairly promptly moved to some hearings or even a markup in the Ways and Means Committee, and that's where you'll see the real legislative activity take hold. But then the focus shifts over to what does the Senate do? What does the Senate Finance Committee do under Chairman Wyden? And like most legislation, it's a process. The first version of the pooled employer plan that we passed out of the Senate Finance Committee, I think I mentioned a few moments ago, was in 2016. And the bill, which ultimately became Secure, didn't actually pass until late 2019. So legislation, even really good legislation, often will take some time. And that's good, because that means the public has more time to see it, to analyze it, to make suggestions, comments. And I think legislation does improve when it's exposed to public comment and people get a chance to really scrutinize it.
No, well said. And another thing that was part of Secure was kind of some protections for employers to offer income solutions in their retirement plans. Maybe love to get a little background or perspective on kind of how that came to be and why, and maybe where do we go from here? Because I think retirement income is, I really do. I think this is going to be one of the more important topics in the next few years. I think a lot of people thought 2020 was going to be the year of retirement income, and then we got COVID. But love to just kind of hear maybe some background and also some forward-looking comments on your thoughts around that.
Well, this is really being driven by what you might think is a kind of an overarching major trend. Of course, and it has to do with the trend away from traditional pension plans, which provided monthly income for life, no matter how long you live, lifetime income, guaranteed lifetime income. Moving away from that structure, beginning really back in the 80s and continue to this day, and moving away from that to the defined contribution system, which is, the 401k is the prime example. We've moved to a system that it relies almost entirely on defined contribution accounts. So you don't have a pension or a monthly income that you've earned. What you have is is an account with money in it, hopefully a large amount of money. But if you're successful at saving and starting early, but even if there's a large amount of money, since no one knows how expensive retirement will be or how long a person will live, it is possible to outlive your income. And that's the driver behind the desire to find ways to marry up guaranteed lifetime income with a defined contribution system. Now, one of the early ways to do that, and really it's always been legal, is for a plan sponsor of a defined contribution plan to offer up some sort of annuity type contract on their investment platform, along with all of their other investments that they offer and their mutual funds. Now, that's always been legal, but employers were very hesitant for years to do that. And they're still, I think, probably hesitant, but they were hesitant because they were worried that if the insurance carrier that was selected became insolvent years down the road, they would be held liable for having breached their fiduciary duty for choosing a carrier that became insolvent. You might think that is kind of a remote possibility, but it's hard to say. And litigation is expensive, even if you end up prevailing in the litigation. So it's kind of scared employers away. And one of the things Secure did was create a fiduciary safe harbor for employers that choose an annuity provider, a life insurance company, to provide guaranteed lifetime income if they go through certain steps that are laid out very precisely in the statute. So an employer can feel comfortable if they've followed that checklist, that they will at least be absolved of any liability 20 years down the road or whatever if the carrier ends up becoming insolvent. That was a kind of an important Rubicon to cross, a first step. But beyond that, there's no mandate that an employer set up a lifetime income solution. There's no mandate that an employee put a portion of their money into that solution. So there's other incentives and things that the bill did to sort of encourage people to think about these things. One of them is the lifetime income disclosure provision in the bill. So starting and that rule was published actually late last year, and it's still open for comment. It was an immediate to final rule, but it will be the DOL will be taking comments on it this year. And it's a rule that essentially requires that once per year in one of the benefit statements per year, there'd be some kind of an illustration of how much lifetime income a person would receive if they were to convert their account balance into a stream of lifetime income. Concept being, if you see how much lifetime income, how much monthly income you could get from the amount of money you've saved, you might look at that and think, gee, I need to save a little bit more. Or it might also make people think, gee, maybe I should have some lifetime income as a part of my future. So those are the things that are going on so far. This is very much, I think, a work in progress. It's very hard to know what will come next, but the challenge of providing lifetime income in a defined contribution world is a challenge that honestly every country in the world faces. This is a problem of demographics and life expectancy and low insurance rates. And every country, it doesn't matter what legal system you're in, every country in the world is finding that this is a difficult problem to grapple with. And everybody's everybody's coming at it from different perspectives sometimes, but everybody's grappling with really the same issue.
Anything else that was insecure that maybe hasn't gotten as much attention as you thought it would, or is a more useful tool or resource for employers or plan sponsors than is being taken advantage of so far?
Well, I don't think so. I think the key things were, like I said, the pooled employer plan, the tax credits, the safe harbor annuity, the lifetime income disclosure. Those were the major things. I really can't think of something that's really important that hasn't been well publicized and vetted and people aren't looking at right now.
No, I was just curious. I wasn't driving you towards anything. I was just kind of thinking, being interesting to kind of hear straight from the horse's mouth if you feel like, hey, this is the thing that I don't feel like people are really paying attention to, but is could be really powerful down the road.
Well, one thing I think people might have, and this wasn't really Secure so much, but as I said, Secure was still kind of, I wouldn't call it languishing, but it hadn't passed. It didn't pass in 2016, 17, 18. So by mid-2019, the desire of having a pooled plan was still an important policy goal of, like I say, a bipartisan policy goal. And at the DOL in 2019, when I was there, we enacted a rule called the Association Retirement Plan Rule, which is another form of a PEP. It's another form of a pooled employer plan. And it was finalized. That rule was finalized in 2019 before Congress passed the Secure Act. So once the Secure Act was passed, folks looked at the PEP and said, well, that's what people will use, and they kind of have maybe forgotten a little bit the Association Retirement Plan is there. But it's still there, and it's a useful alternative to the pooled employer plans. It's a different structure, but it gets to the same place. That's something I think that people may have overlooked, and I think as time goes on, I'll be watching to see if that's something that also takes off and becomes part of the landscape.
Well, there you go. That's a nice little nugget. I appreciate that. Shifting slightly, I feel like my inbox has been sort of blowing up with a bunch of stuff about the DOL and cybersecurity. And again, not that I want to get into the technical side of it, but what are they concerned about? What are they trying to solve for? Who are they trying to help or protect here as it relates to, cyber risk or cybersecurity for workplace retirement plans?
The thing about cybersecurity is, from the DOL's perspective, of course, they enforce ERISA. The fiduciary duty rules of ERISA govern defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans, and we're talking in that sense around $10 trillion worth of assets. 2/3 of that is in the defined contribution. So the risk of cybersecurity is really the risk that some criminal will get their hands on someone's account balance. That would be a real problem. You can imagine why the DOL would be concerned about that and want to take steps if they could. And there's really two kinds of threats. A lot of people think about cybersecurity as an external threat, but a cybersecurity breach could also be an internal threat. It could be an employee, it could be a contractor, and in the sort of the world of say a 401k plan, you've got a plan sponsor, but you have a number of service providers. The third-party administrators, you have bank custodians, you have financial advisors, a lot of different entities that are generally contracted by the plan sponsor to provide services. So there's opportunities for people on the inside to get their hands on personally identifiable information, and as well as perhaps access to someone's account balance. And there's opportunities on the outside. At this point, the DOL just wants to, I think, alert people to this issue. They want people to understand there are some best practices that can be followed. But the focus really is all about, it gets back to EBSA's, the DOL's core mission in this area, which is to protect participants and do everything they can to ensure that participants receive the benefits that they've been promised and that they've saved on their own.
Got it. Yeah, and it's interesting. I feel like as this conversation around cybersecurity and retirement plans has evolved, I think a lot of people were sort of initially coming at it from, oh my gosh, what if a major record keeper gets hacked and they're able to take money from that, from the assets that are under that record keeper's care. I think that was kind of the, I'm going back a few years, I think that was kind of the initial concern, but I think what we've seen in the market is more along the lines of what you talked about and the real risks, and we have had real instances of this happen where somehow, some way, an employee's personally identifiable information gets compromised, and next thing you know, you've got a big loan being taken against their account, you've got a distribution that's being authorized, and money disappears into the ether, which is not a good thing.
Absolutely not a good thing. It cuts across agencies. I mean, the IRS has to fight every year of cyber criminals coming in and early in the filing season and snagging someone's tax refund before the taxpayer ever gets around to filing for it. So it shows up in a lot of different areas, and it's something that they need to pay attention to. They will pay attention to, but it's also one of those things you can imagine. This is an evolving area. The techniques that cyber criminals use are constantly evolving. The defenses against it need to constantly evolve. But I think it's very good that the conversation is starting to happen a lot. People are more aware of it than they were 5 years ago or more. And we will need to, this will be an issue that does not go away.
Yeah, and what's funny too is I know that some record keepers have implemented some new steps and protections to try to really combat the risk that this, again, identity theft or cyber theft kind of presents. But I always get a chuckle when you hear from a client, hey, my employee was just told that because they changed their address, they can't get a distribution for 2 weeks or 30 days or whatever. And it's kind of like it's tough to win this one where you put stuff in place to protect people, and then the people don't always love it. So I'm with you. It'll be interesting to see how this evolves, not only from kind of the record keeper and third-party administration standpoint, the people that are actually touching and managing the distributions to, as well as the as you kind of referenced, the the DOL or the kind of the regulatory side of it. So more to come, I would imagine.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And maybe just quickly, I feel like there's a little bit of a game of ping pong going on where towards the end of the Trump administration, there was a handful of, I'm not even sure what the right word would be here, but a handful of things the Department of Labor had kind of put out, and now with the Biden administration, I feel like they're kind of going a little different direction on some of those things that were announced at the kind of the tail end of the Trump administration. What's going on there, and anything that you see that's really that has could have a real significant impact on the way that employers are managing their plans, or the way that employers are kind of thinking about what they're doing with relation to their workplace retirement plan?
Well, I think there's probably three priorities that the Biden administration will pursue at the DOL and at EBSA, Employee Benefits Security Administration. And these are rules relating to the topics of ESG, proxy, and fiduciary. Now, fiduciary, of course, has been with us for a decade. The issue will probably never go away because the importance of protecting plan participants and having them have access to sound advice is never going to go away. But for the moment, I think the one that the administration probably will pursue first is ESG and proxy, because at EBSA, that's the one tool they have to help the administration implement its policies in the area of climate change. We don't tend to think of climate change and pension policy as the same thing. But in this one area, ESG and proxy, they kind of come together. And that's because the move toward ESG, and I'm assuming your listeners know what that means, environmental, social, and governance factors used by institutional investors when they make investments. There's a number of ways to implement those kinds of ESG, like you can use screens, you just say don't invest in a carbon-based company, or you insist on the board of directors being diverse and inclusive. there's a lot of different aspects to ESG. But the thing that it really comes down to is when you're making an investment, you're an institutional investor and you're making an investment, you focus strictly on risk-adjusted rates of return, maximizing risk-adjusted rates of return for your shareholders or your investors, or do you also take other things into consideration? And in the area of ESG, the concept historically has been that maybe institutional investors should take some other things into consideration. Like, are you investing in companies that are harming the planet, for example? Well, when you get to the area of employee benefit plans, again, I'll mention that the defined benefit plan and the defined contribution plan jointly $10 trillion of institutional assets that are governed by ERISA. And ERISA has a fiduciary duty rule that says that plan fiduciaries are supposed to operate the plan, and that includes investment decisions for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits to the participants. And the Supreme Court has ruled in interpreting that provision that means the focus is on the financial factors, not on what the Supreme Court calls non-pecuniary factors. And so the debate is revolving. It's evolving. You can see where a concept like exclusive purpose would bump up against a proposal that maybe some other purpose should be in the mix, like, fighting climate change, just to use the one that's talked about the most. You can see where those two concepts would bump up against each other. Exclusive is a pretty strong word, and it's been in the statute since 1974. It definitely predates, the ESG debate. On the other hand, the institutional finance world is coming to the conclusion more and more, it seems, if you read the literature and articles, that these factors are becoming much more financially material. So the way I see these things is as ESG becomes more financially material, and it already is financially material in a lot of respects, it will automatically be something that fiduciaries have to take into account. But back to your question about what will this administration do and about that rule that the DOL published last year, I think the main thing the DOL did that I think the Biden administration would want to revisit is they made it very hard for a plan sponsor to make an ESG-themed fund the default investment. I think that's understandable because of what is a default investment. It's an investment that a participant, by definition, a participant hasn't made a choice about what they want their money invested in, so the fiduciary does it for them. It's difficult when you get to thinking about the duty of loyalty that a trustee has toward the beneficiaries of the plan, to make choices for them that involve what might be the political or social preferences of the trustee. But I think there's a path there that if the Biden administration wants to take it to make that a little more accessible to plan sponsors. I also think that they probably would like to say some things in the preamble to the rule that are a little more positive, set a more positive tone. And then the proxy voting is sort of a similar focus, because the proxy voting rule had to do with whether a plan fiduciary has a fiduciary obligation to always vote a proxy or not. And a lot of proxy proposals these days involve issues like climate change and executive compensation and diversity and inclusion. So there was a concern that plan sponsors would be voting their proxies for things that had something to do with other than improving the value of the assets of the plan, which is ultimately always, I think, going to be the focus of plan fiduciaries. They want the plan to provide the benefits that have been promised. So it's kind of a long-winded. Sorry. As a former Senate person, I guess I've got, I've learned to filibuster in my history. Sorry to go on so long about that, but I think that's going to be a big part of the institutional asset debate. It obviously is, but I think that has spilled over and will spill over into the investment decisions of plan fiduciaries, and it's a significant amount of assets that are governed by that exclusive purpose rule.
And just one quick follow-on question on the proxy side. So what, I guess, is the kind of current administration's leaning towards what they would like to see happen with proxies. They want employers to be required to vote the proxies or have less obligation to vote proxies.
So it'll be hard to know until we see the actual proposed rule. If they go that route, I think they probably will issue a new proposed rule for public comment. But it goes all the way back to many years ago. There was a letter the DOL wrote to the sponsors of the Avon plan. It's called the Avon Letters. And that kicked off the whole debate about the obligation the fiduciary has to vote or not vote a proxy. And over the years, there was never actually so much a rule as there was a series of letters, bulletins, practices. And a lot of plan fiduciaries had developed kind of the belief that the DOL believed that you did have an obligation to always vote a proxy, no matter how small your investment in the company or no matter how little the proposal had to do with improving the value of the asset that they held. I think the reaction of the last administration was, let's set the record straight a little bit. No, and the answer was, no, you don't always have to vote every proxy, but you do have to analyze what the proxy is about, and you have to ask yourself, is this going to help the value of the asset that the plan owns, or is it not? That was the basic concept. This administration, I don't know. They could decide they think it's important to always vote a proxy. I'm sure there are people that think that's true. So they might go that route, or they might just want to roll back and say, look, yeah, you don't always have to vote it, but you should not just look at the proxy proposals that you kind of disagree with and try to find an excuse to not vote it. It's very hard to say. I also feel like this is an area like ESG that's kind of wrapped up in a lot of non-financial, political, social issues that people get very passionate about on both sides. And sometimes things that are really, when you're really passionate about things, it gets a little harder to make, clear-eyed, financially based decisions on things. But we'll have to see. I do think, though, that we will see something on those two topics probably this year, and then in following years we'll just see what else they change.
Got it. No, I appreciate you clarifying that. Before we round out here, anything we missed or anything on your mind that would be good to share that I didn't ask you about?
Well, I would just say I think we'll probably see some moves before the end of the year and it might be too big of a topic to raise at the end, so maybe we should talk again later. But I think we might see a move to curb some of the tax incentives for executive compensation. There's a couple of reasons for that. There's money to be raised there for other legislative priorities. A lot of legislation costs money, but some legislative proposals actually save money or raise tax collections. And that's changes to executive compensation could do that. We saw one change to executive compensation in the COVID bill that kind of came in at the last second, having to do with the deduction for salaries of $1 million or more. That ban on the deduction for high salaries was expanded a little bit and raised some money to pay for some other things. I think we're going to see some more executive compensation proposals by the end of the year. Not sure when. Probably in reconciliation, but again, not sure. So that would be a topic we haven't talked about yet that I think people should keep their eye on.
Well, that could make for a fun part two, so stay tuned. And now that you're in the private sector, what are you doing? Where can people find you?
Well, thank you for asking that. I appreciate it. So last summer, after I left the DOL, I started the Rutledge Policy Group. So our focus at Rutledge Policy Group is helping companies bridge what I call the business-government gap. That means I consult with companies who want to navigate or need to navigate changes in the laws or regulations relating to retirement and health plans or executive compensation programs. And I also lobby for companies that need to either shape or maybe modify the new laws and regulations that are in process. Now, I've spent time consulting since last summer on issues like private equity, COBRA, multi-employer reform, I've also lobbied on legislation involving COVID-related pension funding relief, plan termination, partial plan termination rules, and I'm lobbying on new legislation issues like Secure 2.0 to be, in terms of full disclosure. And I've also done a lot of public speaking on topics like we just discussed, like ESG, proxy, cyber, fiduciary, and generally what to expect from the new administration and Congress. So I'm also available for speaking engagements. And as far as where people can reach me, I would invite people who want to reach me to visit my website, rutledgepolicy.com, www.rutledgepolicy.com, or email me. My email is preston@rutledgepolicy.com, trying to keep things as simple as I can. So that I appreciate your asking, and that's what I've been doing. That's what I hope to keep doing. I'm enjoying myself a lot, and that's how you can reach me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for all that you shared today. I really appreciate your insights, and also just thank you for all the good work you did in your time in government. I think obviously there's a lot of good things that came from your influence and tenure and service. So thank you for that. And as you talked about, certainly as things evolve or as we get some other big proposals or changes, would love to invite you to come back again in the future. So thanks for already throwing that out there.
Well, I thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with your listeners today.
Awesome. Well, until next time, I bid everyone adieu, and we will have some more fun and exciting topics coming up here in the near future. There you have it, Preston Rutledge, today founder and principal of the Rutledge Policy Group, previously Assistant Secretary of Labor for the EBSA, and prior to that, Senior Tax and Benefits Counsel for Chairman Orrin Hatch on the U.S. Senate Finance Committee. Good stuff. Really appreciated everything he shared. If you like what you heard today, I had a similar conversation with Phyllis Borsey after she left the Department of Labor, so you can scroll through the podcast archives and find that. Also very compelling in its own right. Also, Preston was introduced to me by a podcast listener, so thank you for that. And if you have ideas for future guests, please send them to me by email to feedback@401kfridays.com. You can shoot me a message on LinkedIn or just whatever works for you. Once you make the introduction, I will take it from there. That's it for today. Until next time, I hope you make your Friday a 401k Friday. And now for some disclosures. The content in this podcast is provided for educational and discussion purposes only. Investing involves risk, including a potential loss of investment. Lockton does not and cannot guarantee the future performance or specific level of performance, the success of any investment, or success of any strategy. Nothing contained herein may be construed as investment or legal advice.